slight delay. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Butterfill, who's Associate Professor at University of Warwick, and he's going to talk about cooperation and motor representation.
So thank you very much. It's a wonderful thing to be here. Humans act together, sometimes cooperatively. You and I, passing each other in a narrow corridor, may turn just slightly to the side in order to pass each other comfortably while hardly slowing down. On another occasion, you are feeling a little bit grumpy and you try to manifest dominance by bulking out and occupying the whole corridor. I press myself into the side, ceasing to move while you swoosh past me. Our actions in this latter case are less cooperative than in the former case. Some actions are more cooperative than others. Motor representations are those which are characteristically involved in the coordination of very small-scale sequences of action, such as those involved when, in the course of making a carbonara sauce, you reach for, grasp, transport, and break an egg. It's a now relatively familiar idea that motor representations are important for the coordination of collective action. But what nobody has yet suggested is that motor representations may also be important for enabling humans to cooperate with each other. And this is indeed the very thing I want to suggest to you today. Motor representations matter not just for understanding the coordination of our actions, but also some of our abilities to cooperate with each other. Simple organizing question. What is it that enables humans to cooperate? What enables humans to cooperate? Before we can make much progress, it would be helpful to fix ideas about cooperation. What do people say cooperation is? Scientists first. A famous paper by Novak. A cooperator is someone who pays a cost for another to benefit. Very simple, familiar idea, widely accepted. Another scientist, Gintis and Bells and Gintis, they suggest that by cooperation we mean engaging in a mutually beneficial activity. Another simple, familiar idea, one that's been developed at length by the philosopher Christopher McMahon. I'm tempted to think that only the second of these is really cooperation and the former is helping, but experts in this area, like Michael Tomasello, think that these are two basic forms of cooperation. So what is this cooperation? What is it for some actions to be cooperative? Ask the scientists and we get these two interestingly different answers. Now if we ask many of the philosophers, we get a rather different kind of answer altogether. So if you ask Michael Bratman, many others would do here, but I think Bratman's view is the most influential and perhaps best developed view. He thinks very roughly, that actions are cooperative when appropriately related to a shared intention and there's no deception or coercion involved there. And reflecting on Bratman and other approaches in philosophy to understanding cooperation, Cedric Paternotti suggests that a definition of cooperation typically has this form, this structure. We've got a set of individual intentions that have certain kind of origins and are related to each other in certain kind of ways, and often, not always, there's a common knowledge condition as well. So if we ask the question, well, what is it for some actions to be cooperative? We can find at least three different strategies for answering this question. Now, for my money, there's an important distinction between those on the left side and those on the right. The attempts to define cooperation on the left side presuppose nothing at all about mechanisms. They are agnostic on the question, what makes cooperation possible? These are definitions proposed by scientists with interests in, among other things, evolution and insect behaviours. They don't want to be committed to the idea that cooperation essentially involves any particular kind of psychological structure. They're happy with the thought that in many cases, cooperation need not involve psychology at all. It's a matter of behavioural rules or pheromonal signals or whatever else. When you take the philosophers, on the other hand, they're characterising cooperation by invoking particular kinds of psychological structure, a shared intention, whatever else it might be. They're also characterizing cooperation in a way that presupposes an answer to the question, what is it that enables us to cooperate? So the way I think about this, I think there are two questions. What is it for some actions to be cooperative? And what is it that enables humans to cooperate? If we take the philosopher's approach, in answering the first question, we've already answered the second question. What is your theory a theory of? I can't answer that question until I've accepted the theory. I have to accept the theory in order to know what it is you think cooperation is. Now, there may be nothing wrong with that. I'm not offering here an objection, but I do think that it's kind of a theoretical defect. It's a theoretical defect because it cuts off a certain kind of argument that we might have. I might want to say, look, I don't think that your theory about what enables cooperation is sufficiently general, or I think there's something wrong there. But it's very hard for me to come up with any line of attack to your theory because you're using the same theory both to characterize the phenomenon to be theorized about and to explain what it is that enables us to cooperate. You're collapsing the thing to be explained, cooperative action, and the thing which might explain it, shared intention, or whatever your favorite thing is. For my money, it's good practice, where possible, to separate the thing to be explained and the thing which explains it. If we can do that, we'll have a better view. So we should try, if we can, to follow the strategy that the scientists use, to separate the thing to be explained and the thing which explains it. However, if we think about the available standard, widely accepted definitions from science, I think it's fairly clear that there is something missing, that there is a dimension or a kind of cooperation that these definitions fail to capture. And to explain why I think that, I want to introduce you to two of my friends who are economists and who got married. Now, after they got married, they attempted in choosing whether and how to act, always to minimize the collective costs involved in acting. So they acted with this one thing in mind when they're thinking about how to act, how should we act? They're thinking, let's just minimize the collective costs involved in acting. So one of them, Julia, she'd be very, very happy to work herself close to exhaustion while her partner rested almost, if that was the way to minimize the collective costs in acting. That was the only thing that they were concerned about. Now, unfortunately, they then got divorced. They got divorced, right? And after their divorce, their attitudes changed. After their divorce, each of them was concerned only to minimize her own costs in acting. How should I act? Well, I should act in whatever way will minimize the costs involved, right? So I need to, for example, sell a house. How am I going to do that? Whatever way involves least effort, least time, least money on my part. That was their thinking. But importantly, even after their divorce, they continue to pursue mutually beneficial activities. These are economists, after all. There is no bitterness. There is no vindictiveness. If I can reduce my costs in acting by pursuing a mutually beneficial activity with you, then I will do so. So now you think about these economists, and I put it to you that the actions they performed before the divorce, while married, were more cooperative than the actions that they performed after the divorce. They were more cooperative before than after. Before, they're attempting to minimize collective costs. After, they're just concerned about individual costs. Doesn't matter how much it costs you. If I can save myself half a second, I will impose an hour's work on you. No problem with that at all. I'm an economist. So now think about the two definitions. The first definition for cooperative action is about paying a cost for another to benefit. The economists do not satisfy this definition either before or after their divorce. At no point are they so uneconomical as to pay a cost for another to benefit. That's not what they're interested in. They have no interest at any stage in the other's benefits or costs. The second definition is about engaging in mutually beneficial actions, and that's something that the economists do both before and after they act. So my suggestion here is that we can see, in the case of the economist couple, a contrast with respect to how cooperative their actions are that cannot be captured by either of the two standard definitions. The idea here is very simple. There are three things. When you have some fixed goal and you have to choose a means to acting. The choice of means imposes costs. When you're acting together, there are three kinds of costs involved. My costs, your costs, and our costs. You can minimize one of these things without minimizing the others, and indeed attempting to minimize one of these things is often incompatible with successfully minimizing any of the others. To a first approximation, one respect in which our actions can be cooperative is that we are attempting to minimize the costs involved in acting. Now we need to improve on that a little bit, but that gives us a kind of first approximation. Now it's important that this kind of cooperation can occur not just in actions which take up most of your life, but also in very small scale actions. So consider a case in which we're passing this lovely program booklet between us. I'm taking it down from a high shelf, passing it to you, who now needs to place it on a higher shelf. If I grip the booklet in the way which is most comfortable for me to perform this action, I will impose a relatively high cost on you, for you will then have to seize the book awkwardly and adjust your grip, moving it from hand to hand. The total time involved will be increased, the total effort involved will be increased. I can make the whole action go more smoothly by just standing a bit higher to grasp the book higher up, passing it to you by the corner so that you can seize the book and place it immediately. In this way, the overall costs of acting are reduced. So there are three ways of engaging in this mutually beneficial activity of moving the book from one place to another. I can do this in a way where I am simply reducing my own costs in acting. I grip it as comfortably as I can. I can do it in a way where I'm just kind of completely selfless, so I will do the most awkward thing I can to reduce your costs. Or I can be genuinely cooperative. That's to say that I can grip it in such a way as to reduce the overall costs involved in acting. Sometimes that means it's more awkward for you. Sometimes it means that's more awkward for me. But what matters is the overall awkwardness involved in moving the book from one place to another. So my suggestion then is that if we think about standard scientific definitions of cooperation, they're missing out something which is, I think, fairly obviously an aspect of cooperative action. Maybe we need to add a further notion. Maybe we need to accept that cooperation is a kind of multi-dimensional thing. There are many different dimensions on which actions can be evaluated as more or less cooperative. And this is one of them, this thing about the costs or awkwardness involved in acting. So if we're following these ideas, following on from these examples that I'm giving you, I'm asking the question, what is it for our actions to be cooperative? And in answering that question, I'm thinking, look, when we're thinking about the selection of a means to an end, we're always wrestling with two quantities. How demanding would performing that action be if I select the means? How much effort is involved? How much time? How much attention do I have to pay? Is there a cost involved? Are there risks? Is there anything ethically dubious? And so on. This is the demandingness of the action. On the other hand, there's the well-suitedness of the means. How well-suited is that means to achieving the end? In simple cases, how probable is it that the action will succeed given that we select this means? Now, any purpose of action will require trade-offs between these things. I take a piece of rubbish and I want to put it into the bin. This is the goal of my action. I can throw it from far away, low demandingness, but also low well-suitedness, unlikely to succeed. Or I can put a bit more effort in, walk right up to the trash can. Anytime you put some rubbish into a bin, you're making a trade-off between demandingness and well-suitedness. How much attention are you devoting to that task? How close to the bin are you going? How much time are you taking? Now, importantly, we're usually concerned with these trade-offs, not just for individual actions, but across multiple actions. We're interested in achieving a good pattern of trade-offs between demandingness and well-suitedness. When strolling in the park, it might be appropriate for you to go right up to the trash can to throw the rubbish into the can. But if you're there with your two inquisitive toddlers who are just off to explore the water in the presence of this vicious, badly controlled dog, you really shouldn't do that. What you're looking for is a good pattern of trade-offs across all of the actions that you're currently performing. Looking after the children, enjoying the view, getting the rubbish into the trash can. Now, importantly, when you're making trade-offs, considering patterns of trade-off between demandingness and well-suitedness, it's not always the case that the only actions you are considering are your own. The example I started with, passing me in the corridor, when you are making just that tiny adjustment so that we can easily walk past each other, providing I make the same tiny adjustment, you are typically achieving a good pattern of trade-offs for my actions and yours. Likewise, in the case of passing the book, if things go well, we will achieve a good trade-off between demandingness and well-suitedness for all of our actions, yours and mine. And this is the idea that I have about cooperation. Very simple idea. Not meant to be the whole story about cooperation, but an important part of it. Purposive actions are cooperative to the extent that for each agent, her performing these actions depends in part on how good an overall pattern of trade-offs between demandingness and well-suitedness can be achieved for all of the actions involved, her own and the other's actions. Very simple notion of cooperation. It's also on your handout. So that was kind of like a long story. When I started this, I thought cooperation, well, people have been thinking about that for so long, that's going to be really easy. And then I thought, the more I thought about it, I feel like we're missing something here. But maybe we're not. Maybe you're going to tell me afterwards that I've got this wrong. So the question so far has just been, what is it for some actions to be cooperative? And I think I've given you a simple-minded, partial answer to that question. But the thing I really want to know is, what is it that enables humans to cooperate? Now, if you take the strategy that I have been pursuing, separating the thing to be explained, cooperative action, from the things which might explain it, the shared intention or whatever they might be, then you're immediately struck by the thought, well, there could be multiple things involved here. What enables humans to cooperate? Perhaps some cases it's this, and other cases it's that. And then you think, well, look, one of the things about humans, among several other species, is that their reproductive success depends critically on cooperation. Cooperation is not some, fancy social thing that was invented in the last century. This is something that our reproductive success, our very existence, depends on. So it's perhaps likely that there will be multiple mechanisms, largely independent mechanisms, each of which is capable of underpinning cooperative action in humans. We shouldn't be looking for a single unitary answer to this question, because if you want to build a robust survival machine, you're not looking for neat, single, unitary solutions. You're looking for a variety of things which collectively produce mostly the right effects. That's how you get robustness. So thinking along these lines, there could be multiple possibilities. I want to suggest, look, I don't think this is ever going to be the whole story, but I think an important part of the story might be motor representation. It might be that there's a certain intra-agentural structure of motor representation in virtue of which our actions are cooperative. That's the idea. So I'm going to explain the idea in the rest of the talk and maybe give you some kind of suggestive reasons for thinking it might be true. But the first thing I need to do is to tell you a little bit about this notion of motor representation. Because the notion of motor representation is something quite unlike intention or belief or commitment. It's a theoretical postulate. It's a theoretical postulate in a scientific theory. What's the scientific theory about? It's about the production and coordination of very small-scale actions. So here's that egg I told you about earlier. I'm reaching for grasping, transporting, and then breaking the egg. How firmly should I grasp the egg? How firmly should I grasp the egg? Well, actually, that depends on what I'm about to do with it. If I'm going to move it rapidly vertically, I need to have a pretty firm grip on the egg. If I'm going to move it horizontally fairly slowly, then I should grip it more loosely to reduce the chance of damaging the egg. So the optimal grip depends on the future actions that I will perform. Not some fact about the world that already exists, but something that I'm about to determine. Quarto and colleagues back in the 90s observed people grasping objects, and they noticed that how firmly people grasp objects depends on what they're about to do with those objects. Very systematic relation between firmness of grasp and future action. This is one of many cases in which in the coordination of very small-scale actions, we see these minute ways in which how you act now depends on your future actions. This is a reason, not the only reason, but quite a good reason for postulating motor representation. When the present depends on the future, and the future is something which you as an agent determine, then it looks like the dependence will depend on representation, in this case motor representation. So what are motor representations? They're the representations which among other things, enable small-scale sequences of action to be coordinated in such a way that what you do now is appropriate given what you're about to do, so that the present depends on the future. Now, what do these things represent? A first tempting thought is that they represent mere joint displacements and bodily configurations. That would be the kind of, as it were, the parsimonious idea. But there's a large variety of evidence, which I won't go into here, but I think I've referenced some on the handout, some reviews, that suggest that some of the motor representations represent outcomes like the breaking of the egg in that sequence where you reach for, grasp, transport, and break the egg. That's to say that the outcomes represented motorically include things which are abstract in this sense. On different occasions, they might be realized by quite different patterns of joint displacements and bodily configurations. From the point of view of the motor system, there is a level at which grasping is just the same thing, whether you do it with the hand, the foot, the elbow, or the mouth. It's all grasping, but of course the joint displacements and bodily configurations are going to be very different depending on how you grasp the object. So these motor representations are things which represent outcomes to which actions can be directed. That's to say goals, things like the breaking of an egg, the filling of a glass. Another interesting thing, basic fact about motor representations, well established, is that they trigger processes which are planning-like in three respects. Planning-like in three respects. So here I want to change examples. So in this example, I've got a glass here, I've got a glass along, and I've got a bottle. And what I'm going to do is to take the glass and the bottle and fill the two things up. So very simple bimanual action. Now the first thing that we need from our motor processes is that they will compute ends given the representation of means. So imagine that we start with a relatively abstract goal, fill the glass. What we need the motor processes to do, what they do is they compute motor representations that can be partially ordered by the means-end relation, giving this kind of hierarchical structure. So that's the first sense in which these processes are planning-like. There's a further sense in which they're planning-like, because you see, in pouring from the bottle into the cup, there's a variety of relational constraints that my actions need to satisfy. Where should the left hand be? Well, that depends on where the right hand is, right? There's a variety of solutions to that problem. They're all about the relation between the position of the two hands. So characteristic of many sequences of small-scale purposive actions is this need to solve relational constraints. Motor processes are planning-like in that part of their function is to solve those relational constraints. The third respect in which these processes resemble planning processes is that they involve achieving a pattern of trade-offs between demandingness and well-suitedness. So to illustrate, the most convenient way to grasp a cup may in many occasions be like this, but so grasping the cup will make the overall pouring operation extremely awkward. You're much better off taking a slight cost in how you grasp the cup and reducing the overall awkwardness of the whole action. So the third respect in which these motor processes are planning-like is that they enable us to achieve reasonably good patterns of trade-offs between the demandingness and the well-suitedness of our actions. That's part of their function. Now, at just this point, you might be thinking, look, this is a conference on social ontology. Why are you talking about motor representation? Right? Why would you be doing that? And that's a kind of good question, and I'm open to different answers here, but here's one thought. So I've got one person, Aisha, and Aisha, as you can see, she's thinking some thoughts, she's got some commitments, and she's doing some things, right? And now along comes Ben, and Ben wants to, do something with Aisha. He wants to make an omelette, which is going to involve breaking some eggs and so on, and he also wants to exploit some of her ignorance and gain some advantage for himself and so on, and he wants to be sure that she's going to live up to her commitments to him, even though he's going to play this trick on her. So Ben has got some thinking to do here. And in order to achieve this, the thing about Ben is he has this kind of sort of model. And this is a model of minds and actions, which involves things that philosophers call belief, intention, commitment, and the rest, and action, right? And he uses this model to make predictions about what Aisha will do. Among other things, the model has many further purposes. And then along comes a philosopher, and a philosopher thinks to herself, well, I better know what Ben's doing when Ben's trying to cooperate with Aisha and coordinate actions with him. And the philosopher offers you this kind of account about beliefs and desires and intentions, which over time gets refined according to various normative principles. Now here's the thing. Most of the time when we're thinking about cooperative action, we're thinking about intention, commitment, and the rest. But where does our understanding of those things really come from? I think the place it comes from is Ben's thinking about Aisha. But the thing about Ben's model of minds and actions is it's not like a scientific theory. So as many people have suggested, have noticed, what Ben's trying to do when he's thinking about Aisha is not entirely to predict her actions. His model of minds and actions also has a kind of regulative role, right? It's telling us how we could be better people than we actually are. It also has this kind of like normative and ethical dimension to it. So part of it is for assigning blame, right? And all the other kind of odd things that humans do. That has really very little to do with what's actually going on in someone's head. In fact, if you ask Ben, Ben doesn't really care at all about what's going on in Aisha's head. What Ben cares about is this successful, life-giving interaction with Aisha. What he cares about is a kind of meeting of minds. He's not trying to understand, explain, or predict. That's not really his business. He wants to get through the day without feeling terrible about himself or about somebody else. One of the key functions of this model of minds is that it shouldn't leave people in too much of a kind of sad and low mood in order for them to act at all. So this model has a whole variety of different functions. The predictive part of it is only a small component. It's nothing like a scientific theory. So if we wanted to understand how humans cooperate, or if we wanted to understand why something occurs, it would be odd to start with this model of minds and actions, where the functions of the models of minds and actions are not really about prediction and explanation at all. But you see, then there's another thing. Then you ask yourself, well, how do the philosophers know about Ben's model of minds and actions? How have the philosophers figured it out? In her magnificent book about joint commitment, Margaret Gilbert is explicit about this. She's very open about this. She says that she's discovered what she knows about Ben's model of Aisha's minds and actions through informal observation, including self-observation, and her own sense of the matter. And I think that's generally how philosophy is done. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. This has turned out, in my view, to be rather successful for all kinds of reasons. On the other hand, if this is how we are doing philosophy, then we should not expect that what we're going to come up with is a discovery about the nature of the mind. That's not what you're going to discover through self-observation and your own sense of the matter. You're not going to discover something about physical objects like that. You're very unlikely to discover something about mental phenomena either. It's just not the way to make these discoveries. It can be terribly important. It can feed into science and other disciplines in all kinds of ways. There's no question about knocking it here, but it's not the way to answer questions like, how do humans cooperate? It's just a mistake. By contrast, theory about motor representations can be criticized in all kinds of ways, and I firmly believe that in the not too distant future, it will eventually be refuted and replaced with a better, more fine-grained theory. But the advantage of a theory about motor representations and so on is that it is exclusively in the business of predicting and explaining behavior. It allows you to make very fine-grained predictions about what might happen if you use transcranial magnetic stimulation to artificially stimulate different parts of the motor cortex. A whole sequence of these predictions that can be confirmed or readily refuted, and can be done so repeatedly. So it seems to me that when you're talking about intention, commitment, and the rest, you're engaged in a project which is never going to answer questions about how minds work or what enables humans to cooperate. And that's fine, because you may not be interested in answering those questions. But if, like me, you are interested in answering those questions, then you are eventually going to have to invoke notions like motor representation. Those are the notions which are going to enable you to answer those questions. Now, I suspect there might be some room for disagreement about this, and my thinking is probably too crude, but we will probably agree that social ontology needs psychology, like ontology needs physics. There are a variety of ways of doing ontology, and there are probably a variety of ways of doing social ontology too. So what I'm hoping is that, although I'm hoping very much that we'll disagree and somebody can sort of straighten out my thinking on this and improve it, make it more subtle, but at the same time I also think there's something clear that we can all agree about here, And that's that the relation between the social ontology and the psychology is pretty similar to that between ontology and physics. Okay, now back to the main thing here. I'm telling you about motor representations. Motor representation 101. What are the uncontroversial things about motor representation? Almost uncontroversial. I've told you that they sometimes represent goals and trigger planning-like processes. In addition to that, you need to know that motor representation leads a kind of double life in this sense. Often enough, when you're observing somebody grasping a bottle, say, the motor representations will occur in you, just like those which would occur if it was you and not me who was grasping the bottle. Indeed, with suitable manipulations, you can observe, you can see in the observer time-locked muscle activations. The muscle activations in the observer are linked to the muscle activations of the person performing the action. So these motor representations are not just for performing actions, but also play a crucial role in action observation of some kind or other. And finally, there are many motor representations which are agent neutral. That's to say that they don't represent any particular agent or agents. The motor representations concerning the grasping of the bottle, which occur in you when you are merely observing, are functionally much like the motor representations which occur in you when it's you grasping the bottle. They're just as suited to leading to action. There's nothing in the content of the motor representations that distinguishes between you and them. There's something else that's making it the case that you're not acting and the other person is. But it's not the content of the motor representation. They're agent neutral. Okay, so much about motor representations. So far that was all about motor representations in individual action, because that's where the theories about motor representations are mostly tested and developed. But is there a role for motor representations in joint action? Well, I think there is, but to explain what the role might be, I first of all need one more tiny theoretical device, something which should already be quite familiar from the discussion of Kirk Ludwig's book last night, since it involves this distributive-collective contrast. So many sentences which have nothing to do with action, sentences like, "The injection saved her life," appear to be ambiguous as between a distributive and collective reading. So if I say the injection saved her life, you might reasonably have in mind a diabetic. She's encountered several life-threatening events, and in each of those events she received an injection, and the injection saved her life. On this distributive reading, there are multiple events, life-threatening events, and multiple cases in which injection saved her life. But there's another reading, collective interpretation of this sentence, where you might imagine somebody who has a rather complicated set of conditions, is rushed to hospital, and fortunately receives 3 injections. None of those injections individually would have been sufficient to save her life, but collectively they did so. Now, the distinction between the distributive and the collective interpretation of this sentence is clearly substantive, because the former interpretation requires the person in question to have had multiple life-threatening events, whereas the latter interpretation, the collective interpretation, does not. So the interpretations are clearly different. So here's a nice simple logical difference that has really nothing to do with action as such. It's a very general difference. But that difference, the difference between collective and distributive, of course applies to sentences where we're talking about the goals of some actions. So if I say the goal of their actions is to find a new home, there is a collective reading of that sentence on which what I mean is that the outcome in question is something to which their actions are collectively directed. That's to say, their actions are directed to this outcome, and that's not or not only a matter of all of the actions being individually directed to that outcome. So in this context, I'm using the term goal to refer to an outcome to which some actions may be directed. It's in this sense that you can say the goal of our struggles is to free Nelson Mandela. Freeing Nelson Mandela is not a mental state. It's not a goal state. It's an outcome, a state of affairs. So here, a goal is simply an outcome, and I'll use the term collective goal to mean an outcome to which our actions are collectively directed. That's to say, it's an outcome to which our actions are directed, And their being so directed is not, or not only, a matter of their being each individually directed to that outcome. Now just here there's a kind of terminological novelty, because some people in this room, as well as Margaret Gilbert and Seamus Miller, have used terms like collective goal or collective end to mean states in virtue of which actions have collective goals. I think that those definitions are fine as far as terminology goes. We can just argue about words, but they do have one tiny defect, and the tiny defect is that they conflate the thing to be explained with the thing that explains it. If you define collective goal in terms of a pattern of beliefs or intentions or states in virtue of which your actions are directed to something, then you can't ask the question, what is it in virtue of which our actions have a collective goal? And you do want to be able to answer that question, because there are many cases involving animals that do not appear to have very rich psychological lives, like honeybees, in which it may well be true that the collective goal of their actions was indeed to find a new home. So you want to be open to the possibility that there can be different kinds of things in virtue of which your actions can have collective goals. But as I say, this is purely terminological. You can define the term differently if you want to. The attraction of thinking about it in the way that I am doing is just that it allows you to separate something to be explained, the existence of a collective goal, from states, mechanisms, behavioral patterns, whatever it might be, in virtue of which those actions can be directed to the collective goal. So the question was, is there a role for motor representations in joint action? And the answer I want to suggest to you in the form of a conjecture is extremely simple. The answer is yes, because there are motor representations which represent collective goals. So the first thing I'm going to do, but this is a conjecture, so this is extremely tenuous. Up to this point, most of the things I told you about motor representation are widely accepted and supported by rich bodies of evidence. May eventually turn out to be false, but it would be a while before we get past them. This is a fairly novel conjecture, which I think most people are likely to reject. There's some support for it, but most people will reject it. So the conjecture is that there are motor representations which represent collective goals. Let me spell that out. That's to say that there are cases in which there are two or more of us performing actions which need to be coordinated, where a single outcome is represented by each of us motorically. One outcome, multiple representations of it, one in each of us. In each of us, those representations trigger planning-like processes in just the way that any motor representation should. Those motor representations, of course, concern all of our actions, yours and mine, so they result in representations concerning actions which, as a matter of fact, you will eventually perform, not just those that I will perform. And this provides for the coordination of all of our actions. Now, this being a wild conjecture, it would be a good idea to see whether it's true. The advantage of theorizing about motor representation is that when you've got a conjecture like this, you can readily generate a variety of testable predictions. And I played a small role in an experiment led by Corrado Sinigalia, Francesca Gabarini, Francesco Delegata, and Marco Rabuffetti, which was based on a paradigm already come up at this conference, a paradigm in which you're drawing a line with one hand and a circle with another. Now, famously, in the case where you're drawing a line with one hand and a circle with the other, the straight line becomes ovalized. So this is a picture of somebody drawing a line with one hand and a circle with the other. It becomes ovalized relative to the case where you're drawing straight lines with both hands. Furthermore, this is a consequence, we know this is a consequence of how the actions are represented motorically, because you get the same effect in cases where the circle is not actually being drawn. You have patients who are hemiplegic, paralyzed in one arm, anosognosia, they have a kind of delusion that the arm is good. You ask them to do the circle line drawing task, they believe they can do it, they do it, you see the ovalization. By contrast, you take a control group of people who are hemiplegic, paralyzed in one arm, no anosognosia, no ovalization in their line drawing when you ask them to perform the task. You can also do the same thing with a kind of using the circle drawing in imagination. So this is likely not to be a consequence of your physiology, but of the way actions are represented. It's likely to be a fact that what you're doing when you're performing these multiple actions is having a representation of a single outcome, the production of these lines. Okay, what we did was very simple, only played a very small role in this. We divided the line drawing task between two people. A confederate was drawing the circles, and the participant was drawing the lines. Now, all of the conditions that I'm going to tell you about were exactly the same in this respect. The confederate draws the circles, the participant draws the lines. The confederate looks at the screen in front of her, the participant looks at the screen in front of her, on which she sees the result of the confederate's drawing. She sees the circles. Always the same. This is the same across all of the conditions. The only thing that we manipulated was this very tiny thing. It was just the way that we gave the instructions. 2 conditions, joint action condition. You and Marco are producing a single design consisting of some lines and some circles. Please draw the line together with Marco. In the parallel action condition, the instruction didn't involve any reference to doing it together. So they were told, just as in the joint condition, to keep their eyes on what Marco was doing and to draw the line. So the instructions were very similar, but one referred to joint action, tried to set people up for this, and one didn't. So here's what we got from our conjecture. The conjecture was that collective goals are sometimes represented motorically. We reasoned that in the joint action condition, it was more likely that participants would represent the line circle drawing task as a collective goal, producing that diagram as a collective goal of their actions, and that if that was the case, we should see greater ovalization in the joint action condition than in the parallel action condition. And that's indeed exactly what we found. We found significantly more ovalization in the joint action condition, lines drawn, than in the parallel action condition, lines drawn. So that's a first attempt to give some evidence for this conjecture. Now the conjecture is also supported, kind of as it were, post hoc, by a variety of other evidence that I won't mention here that other people have developed, but I still think that we should be rather tentative about this conjecture. It's fairly likely that the conjecture is wrong, although an initial attempt to test it, albeit by a group of people who were pretty convinced that it was going to be right, turned out to produce some positive results. So here's a conjecture. I'm going to go with it as a conjecture. Suppose that conjecture's right. The thing I really want to understand is cooperation. How is it that humans can cooperate? The idea is that motor representation plays some role here. But how is that going to work out? Well, here's a reminder. Earlier I suggested, just giving you a partial account, that purposive actions are cooperative to the extent that for each agent, her performing these actions, rather than any other actions, depends in part on how good a pattern of trade-offs between demandingness and well-suitedness can be achieved for all of the actions, her own and the others. And now the idea is extremely simple. The idea is this, that where we each have a collective goal that's represented motorically, our actions will be cooperative in this sense. Why do I think that? Why do I think that where we each represent a collective goal motorically, our actions will be cooperative in this sense? The answer is very simple. You and I each represent a collective goal. Let's switch examples, so it's to do with the water pouring again. So we each represent a collective goal of filling the glass with the water. In you, as in me, but in you, think about you, that representation triggers a planning-like motor process. The planning-like motor process results in a sequence of a collection of motor representations, partially organized by the means-end relation, partially ordered by that relation. Among those motor representations will be representations concerning actions that eventually I will perform, and representations concerning actions that eventually you will perform. Now, at some level, not at every level, but at some level, the motor system doesn't care about the difference between your actions and my actions. These are agent-neutral representations. There is just action. The question of who's performing what is going to be decided at a later stage. Furthermore, the motor process functions in order to achieve a pattern of trade-offs, a reasonable pattern of trade-offs, between demandingness and well-suitedness across all of these actions. So what your motor system is doing when it's producing these motor representations is trying as best as it can within limits to optimize demandingness and well-suitedness, but the pattern of trade-offs across all of the actions, those that you will eventually perform and those that I will eventually perform. But of course, what's happening in me is just the same thing. And then finally, the thing about humans and their motor systems is that we are just not that different. Even in the presence of quite quite striking differences in bodily configurations and so on, the way that the motor processes work tends to be somewhat similar. Sufficiently similar that in a wide variety of cases, not every case, but a wide variety of useful cases, it will be no accident that the plan concerning your actions matches the plan concerning my actions. That's to say that it will either be identical or such that the differences between our plans don't matter for the purposes of coordination. So what we have here, just by virtue of having that motor representation of a collective goal triggering a process which results in something like a plan-like structure of motor representations for all of our actions, is this good balance of demandingness and well-suitedness across all of our actions. And that's just the thing that was needed for cooperation. So the thought is very simple. If the conjecture about motor representation is right, then in a range of very small-scale things that we do together, like filling a glass, producing a simple drawing, passing each other in a corridor, our actions will be cooperative in virtue of this structure, intra-agential structure, of motor representations. Now, of course, this view is extremely limited. So if you're interested in cooperation at some other scale, if you're interested in cooperation in the sense of organizing a conference, of course we're not going to get there. The motor representations have no interest at all in the difference between Lund and Copenhagen, between something genuine and something fake, between, they're just not interested in almost any of the things that you or I would be interested in the larger components of our life. So this view provides a very limited account of cooperation. It provides a very partial answer to the question, how do humans cooperate? What's exciting, of course, isn't that it's supposed to provide some massively complete answer to the question, but rather that it tells us that cooperation starts already at this rather basic level of the motoric that may not, but may, if we're lucky, have consequences for understanding the emergence in evolution or perhaps in development of cooperative action. It may have consequences for telling us something about our experiences of cooperative action and where some of our concepts come from as well. So here's my conclusion. The question was, what enables humans to cooperate? The answer I've put to you, rather tentatively, is that it's partly to do with the existence of a certain intra-agential structure of motor representations. Thank you very much.
Okay, hold your hands up. Let's start here.
Thank you for the great presentation. Okay, so I have a request for clarification, and I guess two questions afterwards. So the request for clarification, you made the distinction between what it takes for actions to be cooperative and what enables cooperation. Okay, and you gave an account of what enables cooperation. My request for clarification concerns the relationship between the two. So the mechanisms that you've isolated and that would support cooperation, does it constrain in any way the account of cooperation that you gave at the beginning of the talk, or do you take your account to be general? And if you take your account to be general, by this I mean the end of, I guess on the middle of the bottom lines of the middle column on the handout. If you take this account to be general, how does it behave in the face of, say, the prisoner's dilemma case? Are you going to zero in on the cooperate strategy profile? And my last question, Bradman makes this point that cooperation is a somewhat moralized notion, and I think it captures a pretty robust intuition that we have. It'd be pretty odd to characterize a situation in which, say, there is a terribly unfair division of labor as cooperative. And I'm not quite sure how you capture that moralized aspect of cooperation.
Okay, thank you. So there's a lot there. So the first thing I want to say is that I do think that the attempt to characterize what it is for some actions to be cooperative is supposed to be independent of any account of the mechanisms. So that was indeed exactly the idea. Now I think that that's a relevant notion of cooperation, because in order for a society's resources to be optimally distributed, it's required that its members perform actions which are cooperative in that sense, right? So I take that to be an aspect of cooperation, but I don't take it to be complete. So the simple point you're making here is, Bratman, the notion of cooperation is somewhat moralized. I think, there's all kinds of things that we could say about cooperation, and I don't claim that this is going to be complete. So in a way, what I want to do is to follow in the footsteps of those scientists and to be thinking about, well, you know, if you cared about reproductive success, for example, what kind of notion of cooperation might you have in mind? And the thought is that this meets that rather stringent criterion, whereas moralizing cooperation doesn't necessarily do that, because it's not obvious that the presence of coercion or deception is going to be particularly important in those contexts. Right? It may be, but you know, you'd have to make an argument for that. So the idea is that I'm open to the thought, indeed I think it's true that this is by no means a full statement of what it is for actions to be cooperative, but only captures an aspect, a dimension along which we can evaluate the cooperativeness or not. But I think there's a contrast between talking about, you know, a kind of common sense notion of cooperation and talking about notions of cooperation which might have sort of explanatory significance, and we should think about which of those two things we want to do. That could explain some of the differences. The prisoner's dilemma case I haven't thought about, and I want to think about that before I give you an answer. I'm grateful to you for asking it. I should have thought about it, absolutely, and I will think about it more. I'm sort of pulled in two directions on that, so thank you. I think that's very helpful.
It was a great talk, and I do have a problem. I mean, listening to other talks you have, where you're talking about automatic mind reading, I wonder, can I really stop to be cooperative? Because if it's really based on this very low level motor representations, and we do have quite a lot of findings that I cannot help it. So if I see you, I sort of mirror you, and if it slows my action down because you are just present, and I don't need this decision whether I want to go in a cooperative way or not. So I was sort of surprised that you found this difference in between the joint and not joint condition, and I was wondering how you explain this in front of the findings where we say we cannot help it and we do it anyway.
That's right. So I think that many things are going to modulate how you represent actions motorically. So your emotions are clearly likely to modulate the kind of the sort of pitch that you're acting at, right? So an angry person will be slamming things around in a way that a very peaceful person won't be, and so on. And likewise, your beliefs about what's happening, your desires and your intentions may well be having indirect effects on how you represent the action motorically. So what I think we're finding in the contrast between cases where we're telling people about doing something together or telling them about doing it in parallel, even though the actual thing they're doing is just drawing a line, right? I think that what's happening there is that just we're kind of biasing things to work one way rather than another, but perhaps in a quite indirect way. It doesn't require that there be some kind of direct connection between the instruction and the way the action is represented motorically. It just requires that it increases the probability that the collective goal will be represented motorically. That's all that we need.
Thank you. So you've been talking in your talk about inter-agent cooperation. So I have a question about whether you think your model could possibly be expanded to take account of intra-agent cooperation. So I'm thinking something like, standard game theoretic scenarios can be run they can be run synchronically and diachronically. So they can be run where you have multiple distinct agents acting at the same time, or you can have like time slices of the same agent acting at different times. And it seems like we should seems to me like we should want an account of cooperation to kind of be neutral between these two structures. So I'm wondering whether you think your account of cooperation can be sort of neutral between diachronic cooperation between different time slices of the same agent and synchronic cooperation between different agents.
Yeah, so indeed the thought, but I mean, so I want to say yes here, but I have the feeling that someone's going to hit me over the head with this in a moment. So I want to say yes. So the thought is very simple. The thought is that, oh, it's gone. If you are going back to this kind of, filling the glass thing, right? So in the case where I'm doing both bits, I'm holding the glass in the cup, right? So there's a kind of sense in which there's cooperation between the two hands. Why is there cooperation there? Why is there a good pattern of trade-offs between demandingness and well-suitedness? Well, that's because the whole thing is a consequence of a single outcome represented motorically, right? So that's what the motor system's for, right? Solving these relational constraints, achieving this pattern of balances. And the theory that I'm offering you, the wild conjecture that I'm offering you, is that in the case where you're holding the cup now, and I'm just doing the bottle, in you, it's just the same structure. And in me, it's just the same structure. So what we would expect then, apart from, of course, the complications arising from the fact that there are now two bodies, right? Of course, that's going to complicate it. But abstracting from those complications, what we'd expect is cooperativeness in just the same sense across the two cases. So that's indeed that's something that's kind of built into the whole approach. It may be a weakness, it may be a sign that something's wrong here, but that's very much the idea.
So first a clarificatory question of how to more exactly understand this motor representation. It's a mental state.
I suppose, yeah.
And it's kind of like a script.
No.
No. Just saying that it represents an action. I mean that's fine, but I mean sort of if you have something that's represented and something that represents, so you want to know sort of what enables you to say that one thing represents the other, and sort of what is the dissecting this representation, what does it consist in?
Okay, good. I think you might be being a tiny bit more. You might be imposing a sort of realist constraint that we don't necessarily need here, right? So the idea is very simple. We have this sort of various questions to explain about action. You know, why does the present depend on the future in that way? That's kind of how are we going to explain that? You know, and so on. And then when it comes to, I'm sorry, I haven't got the slides right with me, right? But when it comes to what do these things represent? What we're looking for here, so we have kind of like a neural signature that allows us to identify sameness or difference of motor representation, let's say, right? So we've got some electrodes plugged into a brain or something like that. And what we're seeing here is that whether you're grasping with the hand or with the pliers or with the mouth, you know, you've got that kind of signature of motor representation reoccurring. So that's suggesting to us that the information carried by the motor representation is more general than the specific case, the specific movements. On the other hand, right, so we're using the kind of correlational method. On the other hand, if you keep the joint displacements and bodily configurations the same, but remove or replace the object, you don't see that same thing firing, right? So it looks like the thing that the motor representation is carrying information about is not to do with the joint displacements, bodily configurations themselves directly, but with something more abstract, the outcome to which the action is directed. And that seems to play some kind of functional role in the theory, right? But that's all we've got, right? So we haven't actually got anything about what a kind of philosopher would want, which is about something about, you know, tell me about the nature of representation. And one of the things you might think, following various philosophers, is that, you know, when a theory appeals to representation, there's of course more work to be done, right? There's a further theory, a more advanced state in which there won't be any representations at all. That might be right. So there's just a kind of model here of what's going on that allows us to generate some good predictions so far, and it is richly productive in generating predictions, and so might very well end up refuting itself. And that's all we've got. There isn't any more of the story to be told. Yeah.
Okay, Luke.
Thanks, Stephen. Very, very interesting talk. I have a couple of clarification I want to ask you. So you started with the economist, let's say, conceptualization, and you improved upon that. And what usually economists do is to keep two concepts apart, and they tend to not conflate coordination with cooperation. And I was wondering whether you made an effort to clarify what you mean by cooperation, and I wonder whether these become coordination in a sense, or you keep these two notions differently, and I'm curious about this. It's not an objection. And whether, the second question is whether your notion of cooperation rely on some aggregation of aggregative mechanism of cost and utility, let's say, or value, and if you can say something more about that kind of procedure, or what kind of aggregation mechanism you have in mind.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So the first one I think I'm okay on. So the thought is this, that go back to my filling the glass example. I can't go anywhere without this. So in this case, I pick up the glass in the most convenient way possible for me as it happens, right? And then I have this very awkward job. So here I would say I'm highly coordinated. Look at this, all of the water's going into the glass, right? It's super coordinated, but very uncooperative. And I think there are converse cases as well. Highly cooperative, very badly coordinated, right? That's two philosophers walking through a door. So I think we can still hold those as orthogonal, and I agree with you that's terribly important. The second case, I'm really worried about this. So the way I'm thinking about it is this: that when we think about pursuing mutually beneficial activities, what we're usually thinking about this: there's some outcome that our actions are directed to. If the outcome obtains, it will be good for you, some value involved, good for me, right? And then I'm thinking, but I'm worried about this. I'm thinking, well, in achieving that outcome, we have a choice typically between various means. And those means can be better or less well suited to achieving the outcome. The probability that the outcome occurs can vary depending on which means we pursue. But also some means are more costly than others. So this is why I was worried about the kind of prisoner's dilemma thing as well. So I'm really leaning quite heavily on the idea that you might, in principle, I don't of course think this is how it works, it's more circular, but you might in principle fix on an outcome and then engage in a problem of means selection. So the way I'm thinking about cooperation depends on this way of dividing outcome and means. Now, of course, that's extremely fragile because at one moment something is a means, and at a later moment that means is now an outcome to which the action is directed. That's right. Why am I saying this? So your question was, look, can we really sort of just fit this into a kind of expected utility type framework? And I think we can't very easily do that because in the expected utility thing, you're just thinking about the different outcomes, and the costs of the means and so on have all got to be already bundled in there, and I'm trying to break this apart. But I'm worried about that. I'm worried that I'm missing something important.
Abe?
So at the end you said, oh, well, this is just an account of like cooperative behavior in a very immediate situation, unlike deciding that we're going to go to the conference next summer together, right? And so that seems like perfectly reasonable. On the other hand, earlier you seem to be saying things that suggested that, well, we really don't have any kind of explanation of what people do at this kind of folk psychological level, right? And so then I'm like puzzled, right? Because how is it possible for me to jointly intend to go to a conference next summer with somebody if I don't have any resources? The only resources you say that we have is like these motor representations, and that's all we've got. So it's like now it's like an utter mystery how we achieve these sorts of long-range joint endeavors.
Okay, I agree with you all of that, except for that I didn't say the only things that we've got are the motor representations. So it's not my view that I am a kind of like motor fanatic, right? But it's not my view that all of the mind is occupied by the motoric. It's true that there isn't, in fact, in a way, talking about motor system is a little bit misleading because actually it's very hard to say which bits of the brain are not involved in production of action, so there's a problem here. But of course I think that there's a great deal more to cognition than the motoric, right? Absolutely. But what I agree with you about is that there is this super big mystery, right? How is it possible for you and I to end up here at this conference once again? And it doesn't look like an accident, right? And I can ask you, right? Hey, are you going there? Yeah, I'm going. And so we can kind of like the information is already there a year in advance. How is that possible? The thing I'm doubting is not that there's no explanation for that or that it must all be fundamentally motoric. The thing I'm doubting is that we can really explain how it's possible for humans to do that by appeal to a folk psychological story. Now, it might be right that we can do that, but I think at the very least what we have to acknowledge is that this is a model which has a very limited range of application, right? So as soon as we introduce some kind of slightly odd cases that are a little bit unexpected, so we introduce some mental imbalance, some complicated emotional situation or so on, that model just will break down, and the philosopher can try and smooth it out in one way or smooth it out in the other, but there isn't obviously anything that's answerable to. So I'm tempted to think that when we're talking about intentions and beliefs and desires, what we're essentially doing is better thought of as setting up a problem, something to be explained, than providing an explanation for how it's possible. Right? Now, of course, I might be wrong about that. So there are all kinds of views about the nature of folk psychology. Minimally, I think we have this challenge to answer, and the challenge is, what is it that makes us so confident that our thinking about belief, intention, and desire and so on is accurate, giving us an accurate picture about what's going on in the mind, when it would be preposterous to make a parallel claim about thinking about the physical, right? Think about people's ordinary thought about physical objects. That's no basis for learning about the physical world, right? That gives you systematically misleading ideas about the behaviors of physical objects. True only within rather constrained limits. Launch something vertically, the whole thing's off, as far as the physical goes. And I think something like that's probably true of the mental. If it's not, we need a good account of why.
But the mental is generating the actions, unlike my beliefs about the physical world are not generating physical facts.
No, that's true, but that's a bit like saying that your body is physical, right? So, you have this kind of physical body and it's really convenient, right? But, what insight do you really have of it by virtue of being able to move it? So anyway, okay, there's a lot. Yeah.
Okay, just I will, for your information, I will carry on 5 extra minutes because we started a bit late and there's 7 more people on this. Next is Kirk.
I was trying to get clear about sort of what the nature of the proposal. I am attracted to the view that cooperation is just joint intentional action, that that's really the core notion.
Right.
And you sort of said, well, this doesn't separate the explanons and the explanon, but I was thinking, look, we're just trying to give an account of, how to understand the concept of cooperation. So, of course, we don't want a causal explanation. That's not what's going on. And so we are separating the explanons and explanandum because the explanandum is cooperation, the explanons is expressed in terms of other than cooperation. We get a kind of separation that's appropriate for that kind of thing. And then you said also, well, if you really want to know about the nature of the mind and cooperation, go out into the world and look at this stuff. Don't do this philosopher's business of doing this self-observation and so on. But that's not actually what we're doing with the conceptual analysis business. It's not self-observation, right? It's trying to figure out what are the application conditions of the concept. And so I'm thinking about it that way, and then you want to say, oh, but the other notions of cooperation that are appropriate for certain kinds of empirical investigations, and you can give people the term. It plays a role in evolutionary theory in various places. And where does it come from? It comes analogically from the notion of cooperation in human societies, right? But it's not the same notion. And then we get your characterization of cooperation. I'm a little bit worried that the way it's set up, it could turn out to people who cooperate in your sense, but not be engaged in joint intentional action. It would turn out not intuitively to be cooperation. And then we get to the mode of representation thing. It's only a part of what's going on when we cooperate. And I'm wondering, what does this tell us about cooperation? Is it rather that it tells us something about the infrastructure of cooperation in conditions of mutual interaction with inside of one another, sometimes involving actual physical transactions between people? Or does it tell us something about the nature of cooperation? But since it doesn't say something about cooperation in all cases, on your own account, how does it tell us about what cooperation is? As opposed to what's the infrastructure of cooperation in the small scale cases?
That's right. So the last thing is easy. It's not supposed to tell us anything about what cooperation is, right? It's just supposed to answer this question: what enables humans to cooperate? Where cooperation is understood in the way suggested, right? So that's what it's supposed to do, and nothing else. It's not supposed to tell us anything about the nature of cooperation. Look, the first thing you said is fine if you're happy to think that there is a concept of cooperation and we can get a handle on it, right? But I'm much impressed by the thought that different people have completely different ideas about what cooperation might be, and there doesn't really seem to be any way to decide between them, right? So some people find it very convincing that you have to have a kind of a no coercion requirement, right? It shouldn't be in the background. And other people find that it just doesn't seem to be motivated at all. So my thinking here is that, you and I and everybody else in the world, we might have different ideas about cooperation. And I bet you that if somebody actually investigated how we ordinarily think about cooperation, they'd find things that would surprise us, right? Just like in the knowledge case. So there's a lovely experimental study by Starmans and colleagues where they asked people, ordinary people, whether they thought that Gettier cases were cases in which someone did or didn't know. And surprisingly to me, people tend to think that in those cases, people do think there is knowledge, right? Even in the Gettier cases. So when we look at these sort of concepts, they're incredibly difficult to understand and pin down, right? So I think it might be true that there is a concept of cooperation that several people have, and that concept is joint intentional action. But I'm not convinced that many people necessarily are going to have the same concept, and I'm not convinced that the concepts like cooperation or knowledge or belief or intention are going to be so neatly kind of pinned down that they serve as good targets for analysis. So it's kind of like worries, trouble, doubt, skepticism really about that sort of project that then pushes you into this different thing where you're trying to say, okay, well, let's just try to come up with notions that we think are going to capture something which is vaguely intuitive, if a society's resources are going to be optimally distributed, then people's actions are going to have to be organized in this way. They're going to have to be cooperative in this sense, right? That doesn't capture the whole thing and go from there, right? So it's kind of a different project. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. In the first part of your talk, you mentioned this distinction between minimizing the costs for me, or minimizing the costs for you, or minimizing the costs for us. And then you moved on to give your account of purposive actions being cooperative. And I was wondering, why did you drop this definition doesn't seem to include the clause that it minimizes the costs for us. So was that meant to be in the in there?
No, it's not. So I apologize for using two terms, costs and demandingness, which somewhat overlap. So the demandingness of the action includes things like financial costs, but also the risks that you might take and the mental effort. And the idea is that it's only a first approximation to think that we want to minimize costs. The truth is we don't want to minimize costs, because usually the available means which minimize costs will just not be particularly well suited, right? So I want to get the glass into the sink. I minimize costs just by throwing it across the kitchen. Yeah, even the us bit. So I think it's a mistake to think that what we're trying to do is to minimize costs. What we're trying to do is to find a good trade-off between the well-suitedness of the means and the costs, or the demandingness. So they are in there, but they're not something to be minimized, but rather something to be traded. Something to be traded. If you always take the least effortful route, you end up often failing to act, often failing. And what you need for success is to get this good balance between the two things.
I think that's clear in the definition, but it doesn't mention the distinction between minimizing or optimizing for you.
I apologize.
For me or for us. So I was wondering why the for us isn't there.
I apologize. Okay, I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question. So that's supposed to be there in the phrase overall pattern of trade-offs for all of the actions. So that's what's supposed to get you in that kind of, that's what's supposed to direct you to the collective part. It is supposed to be there. I'll rephrase it. Thank you. I will rephrase it. But it was supposed to be there in the overall pattern for all of the actions. Yours and mine. Thank you.
My question is related to Arthur's question. It's a question for clarification. It's also about the notion of cooperation, or in particular about the example of the two economists who got married and then divorced. So you said there are three ways of evaluating a situation when we are cooperating. I can focus just on my costs, I can focus on your costs, or I can focus on the overall cost. But I thought there are different ways of understanding the overall cost. We could just focus on the overall amount of quality, say, or the overall amount of suffering. We could just care about the quantity of whatever unit we are measuring. Or we could also focus what I think is the most reasonable way of evaluating the overall cost. We could also care not just about the quantity, but how they are distributed. So if one of them is suffering a lot, if one of them is experiencing a lot of suffering, and the other one is experiencing just a little bit of suffering, it seems reducing the suffering of the person who is suffering a lot by just one unit has more value than the reducing the suffering of the person who is just suffering a little bit by one unit. So I was wondering if this is also part of your notion of cooperation. Is when we calculate the overall cost, it's not just a matter of the overall amount. It's also a matter of, it seems if it's a reasonable way of calculating. To think also about how the value is distributed, and what matters is that they both have an acceptable level of suffering. Actually, I think this is why they got divorced, is because they didn't take this into account.
Could be. Okay, thank you for that. That's exactly, so what you're suggesting, I think, is exactly right, that there's different strategies we might pursue. Now, and this I think illustrates quite nicely the kind of problems where if our target was kind of a concept of cooperation. So, on the one hand, there's cooperation in the sense that I've identified, which is actually kind of completely agnostic about individual people, right? Any particular person. So it's perfectly fine on the view that I've offered that one person will be, have 6 sleepless nights in a row, pushed absolutely to her limits while the other person's putting her feet up, right? That'd still be highly cooperative. What I want to do here is to distinguish cooperativeness from fairness, right? So I think there's another thing that you might want. You might want some kind of fairness, and that will be to do with the distribution of the demandingness of the actions across us. But I think that often those two things are in tension, right? So I think being being cooperative and being fair are sometimes in tension. That's the claim that the account that's the claim that the account is making here. And it's absolutely right, of course, that humans care very deeply about fairness, and that's sort of very much built in. But I think we can separate that at least by stipulation in thinking about cooperation. And I think we must actually. I think we must. Yeah.
Okay, I'm afraid we'll have to finish here. Apologies to the 4 people left on the list. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.